The question came while we were splitting kindling behind the wash house. It was late October, and the maple leaves had gone dark at the edges. My son, Abram, was 23 then. He had been married less than a year. He kept his eyes on the hatchet when he asked me what a wife must endure from her husband. I remember the sound of that blade more clearly than I remember my answer. My name is Malin. I have been Amish all my life. I have farmed the same ground for more than 50 years, raised children on it, and watched grandchildren learn the same paths between the house and barn. I tell these stories because age does not make a man wise by itself. Sometimes it only gives him enough years to see where he was wrong. I would be interested to know, before I am finished, what you were taught about marriage when you were young. Abram did not ask his question like a man looking for trouble. He asked it quietly. That was his way. He had his mother's habit of thinking a thing through before he spoke it aloud. His wife, Lena, was a good young woman. She worked quickly and spoke gently, but there was strength in her. You could see it in the way she carried a full basket without shifting it from one hip to the other. You could hear it when she read from Scripture in the evening. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I knew they had been having a hard season, not a dangerous one, not one filled with shouting. It was the kind of trouble that hides inside ordinary days. Abram was coming home tired. Lena was tired before he arrived. He wanted quiet. She wanted help. He thought she was disappointed in him. She thought he no longer noticed her. Most young marriages are not broken by one great event. They are worn thin by small things repeated without thought. I should have understood that. Instead, I leaned on the handle of the hatchet and gave him the answer I had been given when I was young. I told him a wife must endure her husband's burdens. I said a man carried the weight of the farm, the money, the decisions, and the judgment of the community. I said a woman who loved him would give him peace when he came through the door. I said she would be patient with his silence and forgiving of his roughness, because the world asked much of a man. There was truth in some of those words. That is what made the answer dangerous. A wrong answer is not always made entirely of lies. Sometimes it is made of one truth, placed where another truth should have been. Abram listened without interrupting. He picked up another length of ash wood and set it on the stump. Then he asked me whether a husband must endure anything from his wife. I told him, of course he must. I said marriage required patience from both people, but I had already placed the heavier burden in the wrong hands. I had spoken as though the husband was the weather and the wife was the roof. The storm could do as it pleased. The roof was judged by whether it held. At the time, I did not see it that way. I saw myself as a man giving old wisdom to his son. That evening after supper, I sat near the stove while my wife Miriam mended the cuff of one of my shirts. The lamp was low. Her needle moved in and out of the cloth with the same patient rhythm I had watched for nearly 30 years by then. I told her what Abram had asked. I expected her to agree with me. She did not answer at once. She pulled the thread through, flattened the seam with her thumb, and said, "You taught him what I survived, not what you learned." That was all she said. There are sentences a person hears with his ears, and there are sentences that enter much deeper. That one stayed with me. I did not answer her. I looked at the shirt in her lap and noticed, perhaps for the first time, how many times she had repaired something of mine. Not only shirts, not only coats. She had repaired days I had spoiled with my temper. She had repaired meals eaten in silence. She had repaired the children's confidence after I had been too sharp with them. She had repaired the feeling of home when I brought the strain of the fields through the doorway. I had called that patience. She had called it survival. The next morning I went to the barn before daylight. Frost lay white along the fence rails. The cows breathed into the cold, and the sound of milk striking the pail was steady and hollow. I thought about the first years of our marriage. I had been proud of working hard. I still believe hard work matters, but I had used it as a shield. If I worked from before sunrise until after dark, I believed no one could ask anything more of me. Miriam could ask for help, but I heard criticism. She could ask whether something was wrong, but I heard accusation. She could grow quiet, and I called her distant, though I had been the one who stopped speaking. I believed that because I never struck her and rarely shouted, I was a good husband. A man can be gentle with his hands and still be careless with another person's heart. That was harder for me to admit. There were years when Miriam endured my certainty. I always knew why my decision was best. I always had a reason my exhaustion mattered more. I always believed tomorrow would be a better time to listen. Tomorrow is a poor place to keep the needs of someone you love. By the time I began to understand this, many tomorrows had passed. I finished the milking, carried the pails to the house, and found Miriam kneading bread. Flour dusted the table and the front of her apron. Morning light had begun to show at the window, gray and thin. I told her she was right. She looked at me, but she did not make it easy for me by saying it did not matter. That was another kindness I had not understood when I was younger. Forgiveness does not require pretending the wound was small. I asked her what I should have told Abram. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough and said that a wife should not be taught to endure what a husband has a duty to change. I have carried that sentence ever since. There are hardships in every marriage that cannot be avoided. Illness comes. Money grows short. Children make choices that frighten you. Parents age. Crops fail. Bodies weaken. Grief enters without knocking. A husband and wife must endure those things together. But there are other hardships we create for one another and then name as duty. Neglect is not a wife's burden to bear quietly. A man's refusal to speak is not a test of her patience. His anger is not made holy because he is tired. His pride is not leadership. And her pain is not proof that she loves him deeply enough to stay silent. I had confused endurance with devotion. The difference is important. Devotion says, I will stand beside you while life is hard. Endurance, when demanded by the person causing the hurt, says, I expect you to remain while I refuse to change. Those are not the same promise. Later that day I went to Abram's house. The path was muddy where the sun had softened the frost. Lena had hung diapers on the line for a neighbor who was ill. They moved lightly in the wind behind the house. Abram was in the woodshed. He had stacked the kindling we split the day before. The pieces were neat, all turned the same way. I told him I had answered too quickly. A father does not enjoy taking back his words in front of his son. There is a part of every man that wants his children to believe he has already learned everything worth knowing. But children do not need a father who is never wrong. They need one who does not make them carry his wrongness as truth. I told Abram that Lena would have much to endure in life, and so would he. I told him their task was to make sure neither one became the other person's heaviest burden. I told him a wife should not have to absorb all the parts of her husband he was unwilling to examine. Then I said something I wish my own father had said to me. Before you ask what your wife must endure, ask what she has already been enduring without telling you. Abram stood with one hand on the woodpile. He looked toward the house. Through the window, Lena was lifting a kettle from the stove. She paused to rub the small of her back. He watched her for a long moment. Then he went inside. I do not know everything they said to one another. I did not ask. Some conversations belong inside a marriage and should remain there. But I noticed changes in the months that followed. Abram came home from the fields and went first to the kitchen, not to the chair. He learned which nights Lena was most tired. He spoke sooner when something troubled him. She grew less careful around his moods. Their home began to feel lighter. Not perfect. No honest home is perfect. But lighter. Years later, when their eldest daughter was preparing to marry, I heard Abram speaking with the young man she had chosen. They stood near the same washhouse where he had once asked me his question. I did not mean to listen, but age makes a man slower to move away. Abram told him marriage was not a place where a woman proved her love by how much hurt she could carry. He said a husband's work was not only to provide bread and shelter, it was to make honesty safe inside the home. Those words did not come from me alone. They came through my mistake, through Miriam's truth, through Abram's willingness to hear a better answer. That is how wisdom often travels, not cleanly, not from one perfect generation to the next. It passes through correction. I have been married long enough to know that endurance has a place. Miriam and I have endured sickness, poor harvests, funerals, fear for our children, and the long loneliness of watching friends disappear one by one. But the best years of our marriage did not begin when she learned to endure me more faithfully. They began when I stopped treating her endurance as permission. A wife is not called to be the quiet container for everything a husband refuses to face in himself. A husband is not made smaller by listening, apologizing, changing his habits, or asking what his wife needs. He becomes more trustworthy, and trust is what gives love a home sturdy enough to grow old in. I am an old man now. I cannot return to those first years and speak more gently. I cannot take back every silence Miriam had to interpret, or every evening when I made my tiredness the most important thing in the room. But I can tell the truth about them. That is one of the few repairs age still allows. What I learned is plain. The question is not what a wife must endure. The question is whether the man beside her is willing to become someone she does not have to endure. If this story gave you something to think about, you are welcome to subscribe and sit with me again next time. And I would like to ask you this. What is one belief about marriage you had to unlearn after you had already lived with it for years?